Great. Well, I want to thank everybody again for joining tonight. Tonight is going to be an interesting attempt here for me to get a meaningful demo of a relatively complex but rewarding game, Bloody April. Try to get this in an hour and a half, depending on how things go. Haven't done a live event like this, so I appreciate your patience, but also appreciate your interest in a game that I've learned to really enjoy over the last several months, and that I've taken the time to learn. I don't know everything, but I do enjoy introducing the game to new players. I've taken the perspective for tonight that the folks who are joining either own the game and perhaps haven't gotten it to the table and are looking for a little bit of a jump start on information to hopefully help them get it to the table, virtual or otherwise. Or perhaps you're considering making the purchase. You've heard about the game and you're looking for more information. Bloody April, as you may or may not know, is an operational level game. It simulates the battlefields in the air over northeastern France in 1917. There's a raging battle on the ground, and we are taking the roles of either German squadrons or British squadrons in attempting to accomplish missions that are largely, but not exclusively, but are largely in support of efforts on the ground. The scale is 1 mile hexes. There are 2 minute turns, and there are typically 1 to 6 planes in what we call a flight. Again, this is operational level, so while there is dogfighting and air-to-air combat, it is somewhat abstracted, and it is really more about the missions that the squadrons or flights undertake as far as what we're really trying to accomplish here. So again, less about the dogfighting, but more about completing missions and tasks. As I said, this will be a quick attempt to cover a lot of ground on Bloody April. We'll be covering what I consider to be some of the more important or more tricky elements of the game. Some of the things that are required for Bloody April are pretty straightforward, so I will be glossing over those. But we will be looking over setup, weather determination, detection of your enemy units, movement, and combat. I should also point out that if this hour or so of information tonight isn't enough for you, there's an additional 2.5 hours or so of training videos up on Board Game Geek. There's also some after action reports that I've done, unboxings, and even a review of the game. So there's a lot of support information up on Board Game Geek, where I frequent, to help you learn this game in addition to what we'll go over tonight. There's also additional resources on Board Game Geek from other users. I want to especially point out there's an improved log that I'll be using tonight that I found very helpful. There's an extended sequence of play from a user named Artie Morty, who's done an outstanding job at really breaking the game down into a step-by-step process. There are also pilot rosters, which are pretty helpful for the game. You'll find those up on GMT site. And just as a side note, the reason I did the Join Me sharing feature tonight is simply because Bloody April does rely on a lot of different play aids and charts and tables, and those are not necessarily available in the Vassal module. And so by doing the Join.me, you should be able to follow along and see those as I pull them up. All right, I have pre-chosen a scenario for us to use. Hopefully you've downloaded it, but I also have it here on the screen. We'll be looking at scenario 5 for our demo tonight. Scenario 5 is what's known as a patrol in the game. You'll see that labeled here. Scenarios in Bloody April come in 3 different varieties. There's patrols, there's shows, and there's campaigns. And patrols are the smallest of the scenarios in terms of the number of flights that are in the air that are available to players, and also the duration tends to be a little bit shorter. Shows are kind of in the middle. They're a little bit larger than patrols. They may extend a couple different time periods in the day, and certainly have more units available to the two players. And then campaigns, as you can imagine, are the lengthiest of scenarios and can extend multiple time periods within a day and have many units. And so again, there are different scenario types, allowing us to adjust or choose those based on the time that we have and our experience with the game. The patrol itself that we're looking at here tonight allows us to kind of focus on the mechanics more so than getting lost in a variety or a large number of units, but hopefully it'll facilitate learning the game for everybody. So let's take a closer look at this particular scenario, Scenario 5, and this is a pretty standard layout for all of the scenarios. Some of them do extend multiple pages, but all of the information for the scenario that we need to get started is contained on this individual page. You'll see that there's some date information. So even though the game is called Bloody April, the game does extend from March, late March or mid-March until I think it's early or mid-May, so it does extend a couple different months. Each scenario does typically represent a different day within that time period. But Scenario 5, as we can see here, is for March 16th, 1917. And the designer of the game, Terry Simo, has gone through pretty extensive research to make these, I guess, relatively historically accurate, but also with a little bit of variety to allow for some leeway and some fog of war. The next part of the scenario will lay out some historical information. You'll see that there's some time of day information here. As you remember, I mentioned that the scale of the game is 2-minute turns. And so we have a variable option here for what time of the day the scenario will start. There's also weather information. Weather plays a critical role in this game, and this is giving us some information on where we will, what tables we will roll on to generate our weather. There's information about ground setup. In this particular case, we have information about where the British and German players will place their Archie or anti-aircraft units and their composition between medium and light AA units, which signifies the relative amount of damage that they could do. In the game, we have what are known as tasks or taskings. Tasks are the missions, is just simply another word for mission. There are about a dozen different types of tasks in the games. The ones that are labeled here are offensive patrols and defensive scrambles. They are largely focused on, in this particular case, largely focused on basically hunting down your enemy in the air. But other tasks may focus on artillery sighting, helping artillery determine distance and accuracy for artillery barrages, locating enemies units or even friendly units on the ground and making contact with those units. Patrols and recons. Recons in particular are a pretty significant and historically important mission for especially the British player. And recons are perhaps taking photographs over the trench lines. So there's a large variety of tasks or missions that we'll undertake. But for this basic scenario, we'll be looking at offensive patrols and defensive scrambles. The SSR section lists out some of the special scenario rules that each player has to follow. You'll notice some information here about the trench line. If I can pull up the map for a second, if you haven't seen it, you'll notice this section kind of down here in the middle that's a little bit darker than the rest. That's the trench line. Throughout the different days and weeks and months that are represented in this game, this trench line will actually move. And so the scenario rules that we were just reading will actually let you know what the official trench line is for the day that you're playing. And then there's some information here about scoring, about your victory points. The object of the game is not only to complete your missions or complete your tasks, but to do so in a way that generates the most victory points to outscore your opponent. The rest of the scenario briefing is the air order of battle. You've got the Royal Flying Corps, the British player, up here, and then it lists units. Each unit is known as a flight, which again is 1 to 6 planes within that flight. There's historical information about the unit designation, the aerodrome from which they fly out of, their rating, which is kind of what their veteran status is or their experience level. And then again, a little bit more a little bit more information on their tasking. And so remember, the British are going to be on an offensive patrol, but in this air order of battle section, there's information about what that task actually is on the map. And so they actually need to fly in a very specific manner to actually complete their task. All right. Very similar information down here for the German player. Their Jastas are listed here by unit. We have Jasta 4, Jasta 11, Jasta 30. Also their aerodrome information, their veterans ratings or their experience rating, and then also their task information. So from here, we're actually going to go into the first part of the turn sequence, which is actually known as prior to scenario setup. So let me pull up another play aid that actually breaks out the turn sequence so we can get into the prior to scenario setup section. All right, so here's the sequence of play. I've actually scanned this directly from the play aid that comes in the box, so if you own the game, this might look familiar to you. But I'm actually focusing on this top section here, prior to scenario. This is actually a pretty straightforward section. And what I mean by straightforward is that the tasks themselves are relatively simple to complete. However, they can be quite lengthy. Now, this may rub some people the same way. It's like, why do I want to spend so much time setting up my game? But for me personally, this is one of the things that appeals to me most about the game. At the operational level, a lot of emphasis is placed on the missions and the tasks that you assign to your flights and your squadrons, and the location and manner in which those tasks are carried out. And so it doesn't take us a lot of brain effort to set up the tasks for our flights. But if you're playing a show level scenario, if you're playing a campaign level scenario where there's a lot of squadrons at your disposal, it actually can take a little bit of time. I primarily play via Vassal, and when I'm doing the prior to scenario setup, it's not unusual for me and my opponent to dedicate a good hour, hour and a half, sometimes even 2 hours to this setup phase, because we're actually doing a lot of this planning sequentially or in conjunction at the same time, and also talking through some of the things that we may have questions about. So again, this may be a turnoff to some players, but again, in my opinion, it's one of the things that appeals to me quite a bit about an operational level game like this. All right, the first thing that's in the prior to scenario setup is the scenario weather determination. And as I mentioned previously, weather plays a pretty prominent role in this game, but determining weather is a pretty straightforward process. In fact, there is a set of tables that is specifically dedicated to that. So let me briefly show you that. So here's our weather chart. We're actually going to set up a couple different components or a couple different characteristics about our weather for this scenario. You remember our scenario is set in March, and so the first thing we're going to do is kind of roll for the overall weather condition. And so we're going to roll a D10, and based on what we roll, we're going to generate either clear, mostly sunny, mostly cloudy, etc. weather. I've actually already done this, and you'll see that over on the map itself in this area, in the Vassal module, you'll see I'm moving around a marker that is labeled broken cloud low/medium. So when I rolled it, I actually rolled weather that was mostly sunny. And then mostly sunny on the weather chart down below, the other condition that we have to roll for is where the broken clouds reside, between what altitude bands. And so I rolled a die and I came up somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 6 to let me know that the broken cloud cover is in between our low and medium altitude bands. So again, pretty straightforward weather determination for the overall weather condition. The other the other weather condition that you need to satisfy is related to scenario wind. And when we get into movement, the level and amount of wind that we're going to be facing is going to impact our movement. So again, not a very complicated calculation, but you'll see that there is a row here for March. I'm going to roll a d10 and it's going to tell me the wind speed. It's either going to be no wind, it's going to be 15 mile an hour wind, or it's going to be 30 mile an hour wind. And then another d10 is going to give me my direction. So there's really only 3 wind directions for Bloody April. Wind's going to come out of the northwest, it's going to come out of the southwest, or it's going to come out of the northeast. Just like the cloud cover, I've also done gone ahead and set this up ahead of time. And on the map itself, you'll see I've placed a 15 mile an hour marker coming out of the northwest. And so we'll take a closer look at wind conditions when we get into the movement phase. Ground planning phase. This is a situation where players are going to be setting up mostly hidden units. If they have units that are anti-aircraft units that could possibly be hidden, they can mark that on their log. If we're playing with observation balloons, you can also hide those hidden in some certain conditions. So again, additionally, largely about fog of war in this particular case. But if you have that opportunity, you're going to want to make a note of that on your log sheet. In this particular scenario, we do not have any hidden units. So we would move on to the ground deployment phase. So this is where the players will set up their units on the map. These are the non-hidden AA units, which we have in this scenario, ground units, and balloons, which we do not have in this scenario. So let me go. We actually would move back to the ground planning phase. And in this particular phase, players would determine the map locations for hidden units. This could be AA units, ground placement units, and observation balloons. When you're hiding units, you would place them on your log sheets and want to make a record of that, revealing them when your opponent gets in range of their observation status. In this particular case, for our scenario 5, we do not have any hidden units. The next phase in ground planning, in prior to scenario, is the ground deployment phase. So this is going to be where we place all of our ground units. So moving back to scenario 5, the sheet, our scenario sheet, you'll see that we actually have some restrictions on where we can place our AA units. These are simply hex ranges. And like most everything else so far, I've gone ahead and placed our AA units in line with our scenario rules. So you should see the AA units here within range of the trench line. The British units are in brown. The German units are in this light blue. All right, scenario planning phase is part D of the prior to scenario phase of the turn sequence. Scenario planning is what I was describing earlier. This is where, in many cases, you would assign the tasks and the squadrons that would undertake those tasks. This can be a fairly lengthy process if you're playing a scenario that allows you that flexibility. But for scenario 5, again, we have pretty well predetermined missions and tasks. There's not a lot of flexibility that we have. And so there's not a lot of work for us to do in this particular scenario. But again, in other scenarios, campaigns, and shows, this could be a little bit of work. After that, air deployment. So you can actually launch your squadrons from your aerodrome directly and go through a takeoff sequence. Or you actually have, there's an optional rule, or not even optional, but you have the option of actually launching your planes in the air, starting the game with your planes already in the air in certain cases. Um, so you actually see for the British player, back in our Vassal module, we have flights number 1 and flights number 2 already in the air for our scenario. And then the final step of prior to the scenario is the activation phase. Both players may activate any AA concentrations. So by default, the AA units on the board will start off inactive, but at the end of this part of the sequence of play, you can actually make your AA units active. The question may be, why would you want your AA units to be inactive? Well, it actually can be risky for your own side to fly over your own AA units at a certain altitude or higher, because your own units may fire on you if they are active. So by keeping them inactive, you ensure that even at some of the higher altitudes, your own units are not going to attempt to fire on you. So you either the options are to either leave your units your AA units inactive, or to fly lower so they can see you. But we have our AA units on the board. We have our British flights starting in the air, and we've completed the prior to scenario part of the sequence of play. Let me stop there and let me see if there are any questions so far, and then we'll move on to the main part of the sequence of play. Okay. So what I've actually done in this case, let me give another overview of the map before we get into it. I mentioned our British flights up here already in the air. I've mentioned the different sides that have their AA units on the board. We've already placed our AA units for each side. You'll see that the German flights are actually placed on their board at their aerodromes. Normally when you're playing, you wouldn't put them on their board this early. You would actually hold them in reserve until they actually begin their takeoff process. But for the purposes of this demo, I thought I would go ahead and put them on. And then the other thing that I've added that you probably wouldn't necessarily see in the game are these waypoints. So these are actually the 3 different targets for our British flight. So if we go back to our scenario description for a moment, you remember that the British are on an offensive patrol, and that they actually have some specific requirements to undertake that patrol in terms of which hexes they need to fly to. And I've labeled those hexes on the map. So that's what those waypoints were. Those are the different hexes on the map that the British flights have to reach to satisfy their patrol requirements. As I mentioned, the German player is starting on the ground or at their aerodromes. They do have a special condition that German flights may not take off until a British flight is detected or enters a trench line hex. So basically, the Germans are waiting for word from the front line that the British planes are approaching, and once they get that word, then they can take off and attempt to engage the British flights. Okay, I've actually jumped ahead to turn 2. And so the flights that we see for the British here are not only in the air, but they're a little bit of advance from where they would normally be in the first turn. And it's going to be impossible for us to get through the entire scenario tonight, but I definitely wanted to get through the major points of a scenario, or excuse me, of a turn, so you get a flavor of the game, and perhaps we can look at some things in a little bit more detail as questions come up. But really, as we start during the scenario part of the sequence of play, so I'm talking about this section down here, this A through F for during the scenario. This is the core part of a turn. These are the things you've completed your setup, you've started the game really, and it's time to actually go through the sequence of play and move some units around. And so the first part of the during the scenario part of the sequence of play is the random events phase. Random events is a pretty simple calculation. It doesn't occur in the first turn, but it occurs every turn from turn 2 forward. So actually on the Vassal module, you'll see that in the turn part of the map over here, you'll see I'm moving this flights marker around. You'll see in turn 2 there's actually this little RE designation, just as a reminder to let you know that is when you start your random event rolls. For the random event rolls, one player, doesn't really matter who, is going to roll a d10. And on a roll of 1 or less than 1, a random event is triggered. And the reason I say even less than 1 is because for every 10 flights that are in the air, you're going to apply a -2 die roll modifier. Okay, so right now in the air we only have these 2 flights, the 2 British flights. But if that number gets to or exceeds 10, and for every 10 thereafter, we're going to apply an additional -2 die roll modifier. If you were to trigger a random event, and they do happen, they're not frequent. I don't think they're too much of a distraction for the game, but they do add a little bit of a flavor to it. If you do trigger a random event, you're going to roll 2d10 and apply that result to this table here. And looks like there are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 different results that are possible. Each one has different conditions. There are certain situations where you may trigger a random event, but the situation may be such that the random event does not apply. For instance, there are some that would apply to flights that are over a trench. And if you don't have any units over a trench, the random event does not apply. In some cases, you will also be applying the random event to one side or another. My experience has been, and you even see from some of these die rolls, 1 through 6 British, 7 through 10 German, the random events are a little bit more likely to impact the British side than the German side. And they're not all bad. Not all random events are bad, but many of them are. You lose your engine, your guns jam, but you could also hide in the clouds. So they're good and positive random events, but typically will more likely impact the British player. So you'll do that at the beginning of every turn from turn 2 onward. Okay, the next part of during the scenario part of the sequence of play is the weather phase. And there are 2 subphases within the weather phase. There is a weather event subphase and a weather drift subphase. The weather event subphase happens on turn 10 and every multiple of 10 thereon. So on turn 10, on turn 20, on turn 30, etc. Basically, what the weather change subphase is allowing you to do is check to see if the weather changes. So you remember in our setup phase or setup part of the sequence of play, we were doing some rolls, or I showed you some rolls that would be done for determining weather conditions. Those weather conditions can change, and so every 10th turn, and you'll see that marked down here on the turn track with a WX as a reminder that you're going to roll for a weather change. And so let's go back to some of our weather change tables, and I'll let you get a quick look at that. And here's our weather change table, 2d10 roll. You're going to check for changing winds. You're going to check to see if the clouds clear or the clouds worsen. But there's a chance that even your wind speed will pick up or it may die down. And again, it happens throughout the game at every 10th turn. All right, the next part of the the weather phase is the drift subphase. And so, as I've mentioned or hinted at a couple times, weather plays a very important role in this game. And one of those parts or characteristics of weather deals with wind. And so, if you remember during our planning phase, we generated a wind speed for our weather of 15 miles an hour. And that's indicated here by this marker on the Vassal map. So, as we're playing, we've got a wind coming out of the northwest that is pushing us along at 15 miles an hour if you've got a tailwind, or maybe slowing us down by 15 miles an hour if you've got a headwind. And so in this phase, we're going to see if those winds are strong enough to cause our units in the air to drift. So this is probably the first, what I would call, relatively complex concept that this game introduces, and this idea of wind drift as it relates to wind and the position of your flights. So I've pulled up a little chart here that I've copied from the manual, and basically what you're trying to determine with this graph is whether the wind speed and the wind direction is generating a headwind, a tailwind, or if you are in fact perpendicular to the wind direction. And so, as I mentioned before, we've got a wind out of the northwest, and for every 15 miles an hour of wind speed, it's going to move our flight around what we call a 0.5 carry. And a 0.5 is basically 0.5 movement points, and we'll talk about movement in a little bit. So let me give you an example here, and hopefully maybe this will clear it up a little bit. But again, we've got a wind out of the northwest. It's 15 miles an hour, and I want to check the facing of my flights. All right, so I want to check the facing of my flights. And so in this particular case, both of my flights are facing due east. And one of the things that actually kind of threw me about this game initially is that, and I don't know if other games do this, and perhaps they do, it's unique in my experience with war games, but actually we have 12 facing directions. We don't actually only have 6 facing directions. We actually have 12. So not only can you face a hex side, like number 1 is doing right there, but you can also face a hex corner. And so hopefully you saw unit number 1 rotate at 360 degrees, but had 12 different facings, 6 hex sides and 6 hex corners. So basically I'm trying to map the position and facing of my squadron on the wind speed or the wind drift direction chart that I pointed out earlier. So let's look at, again, wind out of the northwest. My flight is facing this particular hex right here. I don't know if you can see that. It's facing a hex. And you'll notice that that section has a plus 0.5, right? So it basically means that I'm going to pick up a plus 0.5 movement drift because of wind speed. The way that I would indicate that on the map is I would place a plus 0.5 counter, and you actually see that squadron number 1, or I should say flight number 1, already has a plus 5 marker right here. All right. So basically, the reason we call this the drift phase is because you may have generated enough speed from your movement and from the strength of the wind to actually drift your unit in a certain direction. So basically what happens is, because I've generated a plus 0.5 drift and I already have a plus 0.5 marker on the board, I've created an additional 1 movement point of drift that I would apply in this phase. And that's a lot of words for saying simply, I move my unit forward 1 hex. Okay. So because of that drift, because of the speed I've already generated, because of the wind speed, I've generated one additional movement point, and my flight number one has drifted 1 hex. Also, because I've now expended the existing plus 0.5, I want to remove that from the map. And I've also moved his altitude marker forward. We'll talk about altitude in a couple moments. Let's do the same thing for flight number two. We know that flight number two is actually facing the same direction as flight number one. We knew from the previous calculation that it had a plus 0.5 tailwind, and so I want to apply that 0.5 tailwind to flight number two. But flight number two does not have a plus 0.5 marker on the board, so it's actually going to, in a sense, bank that value for later movement. So let me go ahead and place what's called a carry marker on the board for flight number two. Great. So these are the only two flights that are in the air. You can imagine if they were facing the opposite direction and they were generating a headwind, how that would slow them down, and instead of applying a plus 0.5, you would apply a minus 0.5 in terms of drift. So again, think about when you're, think about the scenario or think about the situation. This is the earliest days of air aviation. We've got, by today's standards, these very relatively incapable planes. Are not very strong. They're not very fast overall. And they're very easily pushed around by the elements. And this is one way that this game represents that by introducing this idea of wind drift. Okay, so we made it through the first kind of heavy concept of the game. Does anybody have any questions about wind drift? All right, probably a good time to chime in if everyone can just let me know you're still with me and we're ready to go forward. Okay, once you get the handle of wind drift, you'll be doing a lot of wind drift checks in this game. You'll be doing it every turn. You'll be doing it for every unit's in the air. But really, after a period of time, it does become second nature. So if it seems a little bit complex or over the top for you, don't worry. After a short period of time, you'll have it pretty handily under your belt. Okay, now we move on to the detection phase. The detection phase is initially concerned with ground observation. So as I mentioned at the outset, even though we're flying in the air, there's an entire battle raging on the ground beneath us, and so there are not only enemy ground units who are fighting each other, or ground units who are fighting each other, but there are also units who are looking for us from the ground. And so the ground observer subphase is trying to model ground units who are primarily in trench hexes, but also in active aerodromes, to see if they can detect that a plane or a flight with a number of planes is approaching. You'll remember from when we were going over the scenario that one of the conditions for the German player was that the British player had to be detected or had to be over the trench lines before they could take off. So this is, in this particular scenario, is a very important subphase for the German player. They wanted to detect the British coming as soon as possible. I've pulled up the ground observer subphase, or the detection table for these subphases. One of the things that the Bloody April Plaids does is it does put a lot of the rules on the Plaids themselves rather than in the rule book. So you always want to remember to check your play aids to make sure you're getting the benefit of the entire rule. But ground observation is kind of found intermingled here in a couple different sections on this page. It's along here at the top. This is the primary information about the rule. And then there are some die roll modifiers that are found here at the bottom. Okay. The rest of this particular table applies to other phases, which we'll get to in a little bit. But ground observation is again pretty straightforward. Essentially, you want to check to see if any flights are in range of a unit that could, or a hex that could possibly sight them, or possibly put visual sighting on them. The range for sighting is dependent on the altitude of the target, and so this information is listed right here. Let me pull up the map again and give you a bigger picture. So if a flight is at deck plus 0, and again we'll talk about altitude in a couple moments, the range for that from a hex unit would be 1 hex. If the flight is at another level within the deck band, the range is 3 hexes. If they're at low altitude in the low band, the range is 6 hexes. And then anything above that, medium or higher, the range is 10 hexes. So if you take, for instance, this hex 2301, you'll see these little blue squiggly lines. You'll see these little red squiggly lines. Those represent the British and German trenches, respectively, blue for British, red for German. And so we're going to measure from that particular hex, or any of these hexes that have trenches in them, to see if they are within range of our British flights who are currently at altitude low plus 6. And again, low plus 6 has anything within the low band has a range of 6. So from 2301, I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So these particular flights are not in range of sighting within from any of the trench lines. They're just simply too far away and too low for anybody in the trenches to see them currently. And that's pretty typical. Most of the British aerodromes and even the German aerodromes are mostly, not all of them, but most of them are out of initial sighting range at most altitudes. But as this British unit, as these British units approach and get closer and closer, they will at some point get in range of these trench lines, and then that's when you want to make your ground observation check. The ground observation check is a simple 2d10 roll. You're looking to roll a 12 or higher, and there are certain die roll modifiers. So let me go back to that play aid. And you'll see that these die roll modifiers are largely a function of the type of weather that you're facing. If you're in rain, if you're in fog, if you're in snow, etc., you'll be applying die roll modifiers to that 2d10 roll. Okay. If a unit is detected, it becomes detected, not surprisingly, which is simply flipping the counter to the other side. And you'll see it takes on a little bit of a different type of visual treatment there. Rather than having the question mark, it now has this kind of halo effect, and the unit is now detected. Detection is not only important for the scenario purposes, but it is also important for engaging enemy units in combat. If you want to attack someone, you actually are supposed to know that they are there, and so they need to be detected. Side note on the ground observation detection roll, 20s are an automatic success, 2s are an automatic failure. All right, so that was for demonstration purposes. Right now, this does not apply because our units are not currently in range. Let me briefly touch on the next part of the detection phase, the visual detection subphase, which is a mouthful, but it basically is a mechanism to represent. I'll just call it air-to-air sighting. So, air units sighting other air units. There are no German players or German flights in the air, so again, this doesn't apply this early in the game. But once the German flights and the British flights get closer, they not only want to detect each other, but they want to make visual identification. The reason visual identification is important is it provides additional information about your opponent. If you successfully visually identify an enemy, you'll get information about the number of planes that are in its flight, the type of airplane it is, its altitude in feet, and whether there are any damaged or crippled planes that are part of that flight. So again, usually the first step is someone gets ground observation on the flight. Your units will close on that enemy and then will close to detection range, which is 5 hexes. But also each difference in altitude band counts as a hex. So if I'm at low and they're at medium, that counts as a 1 hex difference or 1 hex distance. But within 5 hexes, you can start to make the visual detection rolls. We'll do an example of that a little bit down the road, but just wanted to let you know that that was part of the detection phase. All right, next up is the movement phase. This is obviously, as you can imagine, a pretty important set of rules that deal with movement of your units and movement not only on the horizontal plane but also on the vertical plane as we climb and dive. This is also the phase in which we'll be potentially engaging our enemy units, also perhaps moving into range of friendly or enemy anti-aircraft units. And so there's a lot that goes on in this phase. So I hope to take you through that. So I'm actually going to pull up some air data cards, which I've scanned. You'll find these in the game that contain all the characteristics of our individual plane types. And they're going to help us figure out how movement works in the game. Bloody April uses a chit draw system for initiative. The German player will always have the initiative in the movement phase, meaning they get to determine whether they're going to pull first or whether the British are going to pull first. There are different types of chits to pull. There's a small chit and a large chit. Whether you pull one or the other is going to be determined by the number of flights that you have in the air. If you have 9 or fewer flights in the air, you're going to pull a small chit. If you have 10 or more flights in the air, you're going to pull a large chit. We only have 2 flights in the air, so this doesn't really apply to us right now. In fact, because the Germans are not in the air, the British flights can make all of their movements. During the movement phase, you'll get to move your flights 1 time each. And once you've moved all your flights, your movement phase is essentially done. When you pull chits, there is a chance, especially with the small chits, that you may pull a 0, which simply means that the order would then revert to your opponent's side. So just because you get to pull first doesn't necessarily mean that you get to go first. And there is a little bit of strategy in determining whether, for the German player, whether to determine, do they want to see the British player move and see what they're up to, or are they within closing range, and do they want to close quickly so they can close for the kill and engage their enemy? All right, so for the purposes of this section, we'll go ahead and assume that, or not even assume, but we'll play it out the way it is on the board. The German player is not in the air yet, but the British player is. We've got 2 flights, and they're both ready to move. So there are 3 different types of movement that you can engage in, or 3 primary types that you'll most often be using. There's level flight, there's climbing flight, and then there's diving flight. And the distance and direction that you can move is determined by your speed. And each plane has a speed rating on their air data card that corresponds to their current altitude. So our 2 flights are at the low band, and they're at actually low +6, but they're in the low band. So if we look at these 2 air data cards, we didn't go over this so much, but we've got FE2Bs and Sopwith 1.5 strutters that are in the air. They're both at low, and so our FE2Bs have a speed of 2.5 at low, and the Sopwiths have a 3.0 speed at low. So the Sopwiths are a little bit faster at this altitude. So the first example I'm going to give is level flight. So we're not going to change altitude. We're just going to fly level. And flight number 1 is the FE2B. So this unit that's in the north, that's the FE2B. He has 2.5 movement points, or 2.5 speed, that he can apply for level movement. And each movement point allows you to move essentially 1 hex. Okay, that is your maximum speed. The maximum speed is what is listed here in the air data card. You actually have the option of flying up to 1 movement point less than that maximum speed in half-point increments. So this FE2B could fly 2.5 movement points, he could fly 2 movement points, or he could fly 1.5 movement points. That would be the minimum that he could fly at this altitude. The level flight, pretty straightforward. Each point is a hex, and any remainder that you haven't spent is going to be another one of those carry markers. So let me move the FE2B level for 2.5 movement points. Okay, so hopefully that was pretty straightforward. He had 2.5 movement points. He moved 2 hexes, and so he had a half a point remainder, and you'll see that represented by that plus 0.5 marker. And again, we use those during the subdrift phase, and even if you have those during a movement phase, you can apply it. You can use it as a carry, and we'll see that here in a moment with phase 2, or with flight number 2. Okay, in addition to moving simply straight forward, you can actually turn. So there is a free turn that's available to a flight when it enters in a new hex. When you enter in a new hex, it is determined by your current speed, but in most cases you're going to find that you have a free 90-degree turn when you enter into a new hex. So let me back up flight number 1 and just give you a quick example of that. Okay, again, flight number 1 has 2.5 movement points. He can move forward 1 hex. Since he's entered into a new hex, he gets a free up to 90-degree turn. He can move ahead for another movement point, and then his turn in that position. But hopefully you get the idea. Anytime you enter it, and since he moved into a new hex, he could actually turn again, even though his forward movement is ended. He could turn, let's say, 30 degrees. And when you turn 30 degrees on a spine, you actually in a sense, drift into the new hex or the adjacent hex. All right, so level flight, that's a pretty quick example. I'll leave him there for now. Let's not forget his +5 carry. And now let's look at some climbing flight. Climbing flight allows a flight to essentially increment their current flight counter by 1 notch in exchange for 1 movement point. And let me give you an example of that. Flight number 2, they are our Sopwiths. At low altitude, they have 3.0 movement points. And let's say that they wanted to do climbing, a climbing move. So they're currently at low +6. If they want to climb, they can end up at low +7, the next increment in their flight counter or their altitude counter, by spending one of those 3 movement points, those 3 original movement points. And then after that, they can use the remaining movement points, which would be 2 in this case, to carry out what in many cases would seem like level flight. They have the free turn, although it's a little bit reduced. They can move forward, they can be on a hex side, they can be facing a hex corner, etc., etc. So let's do an example of flight 2. He's going to climb one notch. He has 3 movement points. I'm going to notch up the low counter. You should see that that's changed to low +7, and now he has 2 additional movement points of his original 3 to move forward or move like we've described with level flight. Flight number 2 did have this +5 carry, but he hasn't spent it, so he retains it until the next movement phase. The last type of movement I like to describe is diving flight. Diving flight actually uses a different column in the on the ADCs. So you actually see on the ADCs there's an actual dive speed column that's all the way to the right of the air data card. So as you can imagine, when you dive, you can fly faster. So you'll see that each of these dive speeds is quite a bit, or not quite a bit, but is noticeably higher than the common or normal airspeed. When you dive, you have a couple different options or choices to make with your unit. If you dive within your current altitude band, so for these 2 flights, if they dive within low, they can choose any increment of that band, but they get to do so without expending a movement point. So if our number 2 Sopwith, he's going to dive, he would have 4 movement points for low. If he stays within the low band, he can then use the remaining 4 movement points for regular movement. So he could go to low +0, low +1, low +2, etc., as long as he stays within low. If you dive into a lower altitude band entirely, which in this case would be somewhere within deck, which is the lowest altitude band, then you do spend one of your movement points for that altitude change. All right. So let's say that flight number 2 is going to dive. He's at low. He has 4 movement points. He's going to dive to deck plus 1, let's say. So of those 4 movement points, he's going to spend 1 for the altitude change, and then 3 movement points he can spend for turning and regular movement. So he'll go 1, 2, 3. He retains his plus 0.5. And as I said, he was going to end up somewhere in the deck band. and I think I said it was going to be deck +1. So obviously a lot of movement options, a lot of choices to make in terms of, are you going to climb? Are you going to stay at a current altitude? Does that position you in a certain way? If you remember back to our weather discussion, you may have cloud cover that you may want to fly into, or you may want to try to flush out your enemy if they're hiding in cloud cover. So not so much in this particular scenario 5, but really throughout the game, movement, altitude, placement of your units based on speed is going to make a pretty big impact on the game. We actually do have some restrictions in this scenario that required our flights to stay at a certain altitude and close to each other. So I'm just going to move these guys back. But hopefully that gave you a pretty good idea of the way that some of the movements worked. Okay, thanks for hanging in there with me for a while. I've obviously gone through my 1 hour allotment, but hopefully you can stay with me for a little bit longer. A couple more things that I want to go through. First of all, one of the things that may happen when you're flying is that you may come in range of an anti-aircraft unit or anti-aircraft unit that's on the ground. So let me move our units a little bit closer and give you an example of this. So our units have advanced to the trenches. They've been detected from the trenches. And so the German planes, let's say, are getting ready to take off. They've gotten word that the British flights are approaching. And the British planes have to continue on their offensive patrol. But to do so, they're going to have to cross through some dangerous territory that's covered by anti-aircraft units. So the anti-aircraft units, also known by Archie, are represented by, in the German case, these blue counters. And the reach or range of an anti-aircraft unit is not only the hex that it is in, but also the 6 surrounding hexes. So not only is this particular Archie unit capable of shooting at someone or a unit that flies into its specific hex, but all 6 of the surrounding hexes, anything that flies into those hexes would be a potential target. So let's say that hypothetically our British flight flies forward into range of this Archie unit. Once it moves in, the owner or the player who controls that Archie unit is going to make a roll to see if it hits the plane. Or the flight, I should say. It's multiple planes. So as you can imagine, we have additional tables for that. The first thing you're going to do is match up the Archie strength, which in this case is L, or light. It's a light AA unit. And cross-reference that with the current altitude of the target. So the target is at low. We've got a light Archie unit, and you'll see that the target number to roll is 16 or higher. So on a 2d6, the owning player would roll 2d6. If they get a 15 or lower, they would miss and there would be no effect. 16 or higher, we want to go to the Archie damage table. So we want to see not only did we hit, but was there any impact. So you can actually hit a unit but have no effect, this any result here. But you can damage, you can cripple, you can shoot down units based on this roll, and this roll is going to be impacted by certain die roll modifiers, largely about target speed and the type of task that they're undertaking. But in many cases, there's no die roll modifier. Roll 2d6 and see what your result is and apply those results. Whether there is, let's say that you do hit your unit or the unit that is flown within range of your anti-aircraft, whether there's an impact or not, you do roll on what's called the wind up table. And the wind up table, in a way, represents the morale or impact on morale of the flight. And so an actual outcome of the wind up roll could be that the unit abandons the entire mission. They may not have been damaged, but it was hot enough for them in that zone that they are going to give up and abort and fly back to their aerodrome. So again, you don't, if the AA unit misses, you don't roll on wind up, but if you do hit, whether there's an effect or not, you do roll on the wind up table. And yes, it does suck if you have a 6-plane flight who is well underway in their mission. They take some AA flak and they decide to give up entirely, especially in a mission this small or a task scenario this small. That really can ruin your day. One other note about AA attacks. If you do hit, whether there's an effect or not, your opponent does have to relay certain bits of information to you. If the flight was undetected and they were hit, the unit becomes detected, so you want to flip them over. And you also want to give the information that I talked about earlier for the visual identification phase. The number of planes in the flight, the altitude at which they are in at feet, the type of plane that they are, and whether there are any damaged or crippled planes. So there is some information there if you at least successfully hit a unit with your AA guns. Okay, I've jumped ahead a couple turns, and if you're looking on via the Vassal module, you may need to resync. But I've jumped ahead a couple turns to get to the concluding parts of the demo for tonight that hopefully you've been anticipating, which is air-to-air combat. We're actually going to pick up in the visual detection subphase. And I described this phase earlier, but you remember that I described this as the kind of air-to-air portion of visualization. Can a flight in the air put its eyes on, identify, recognize an enemy flight, and gain some information from it, and also make it a little bit easier to engage in attack. So before we get into air-to-air combat, let's run through that visual detection subphase. The information for that phase is back on the detection table, which we referenced earlier for ground observation, but we're going to now look at it for visual detection. Visual detection is also known as tallying. So can you tally your opponent? The first condition that you need to satisfy is to understand whether you are in range. The basic range again is 5 hexes, and that can also include a difference in altitude. So again, if you've got a 1 altitude band difference, that's going to count for 1 hex range, 2 altitude band, 2 hex ranges, etc. The situation we have here on the board, we actually have our British flights have made a little bit of progress through their flight objectives or their tasking objectives. They're on their way to the second waypoint, and we have the German flights in the air closing in, hoping to engage what they now understand to be some enemy units that have kind of crossed over the trenches. So let's do an example or two of visual identification, the visual identification subphase. It really doesn't matter which order that you do it in. You know, if the British player is in range of the German player, then the reverse is true. Again, the ranges you want to be is within 5 hexes. You're going to roll a 2d10. 12 or higher is a success. A 20 is an automatic success. A 2 is an automatic failure. And that roll is going to be modified by a series of die roll modifiers. First modifier is based on the range. So each hex difference in range is going to be a -1. It's also going to be modified by the flight size. If the flight size is only 1 plane, there's a -1 modifier, all the way to +4 if there are 4 to 6 planes in the target. If you're trying to tally a dogfight, which we won't necessarily cover tonight, there's a positive modifier of +5. If a flight is already tallied and you're trying to tally it, you do get a bonus for that. And then if a flight is undetected, you would get a -3 modifier. And that's a pretty rare occurrence where you would actually have the opportunity to put a tally on someone who's undetected, but there are certain circumstances where that applies. The last couple modifiers, we actually have this represented on the board. When a unit is the subject of an anti-aircraft attack, you actually place what's called a flak burst counter on the map on top of the target, and you actually see that here on the Vassal module. This blue German marker that's got the flak burst design on it. If you're trying to identify a unit that is underneath that, you actually get a pretty healthy die roll modifier for your attempt to tally. So let me run through this for real really quickly. We'll do A attempting to tally flight number 2. The range is 1 hex, 2 hexes, 3 hexes. They're both at low altitude, so there's no altitude difference. So the range is 3. That's a -3 die roll modifier. I haven't shown you the flight log yet. Let me give you a really quick look at that. Here's our flight log. Perhaps you downloaded it. But flight number 2 has 1, 2, 3, 4 planes in it. And I set this all up ahead of time in the pre-scenario phase. So there are 4 planes in that flight. So that +4, or those 4 planes in the flight give me a +4 modifier. You wouldn't necessarily know this information. Your opponent would have to help you do the calculation if that information hadn't been revealed yet. But there's the modifier nonetheless. And then since that particular flight was the subject of an anti-aircraft attack, and it does have that Archie counter, there's an additional +5 modifier. So the entire modifiers are -3 for the range, +4 for the number of planes in the flight, and then +5 for the flak burst, which nets out to +6. So 2d10 +6 in this case, 12 or higher. the flight becomes identified. So I'll go ahead and roll that. 14. So that's a successful identification, and a couple things would need to happen at this point. First of all, the actual flight marker gets removed. And you would bring on the identified marker, which is an entirely different counter. And you'll see that that counter actually has a designation of which squadron it is and which type of plane it is. Additionally, if you're successful in visually identifying someone, you place a tally marker, which I won't do here, but it's a simple marker to let us know that Flight A has tallied this particular flight. And then in this case, the British player would reveal additional information about the flight. And again, it's the number of airplanes, the type of airplane, the altitude in feet, and the number of damaged and crippled airplanes in that flight. Okay. In reality, all three of the German flights, A, B, and C, in both of the British flights are within range of each other, and it's really up to you to determine the order in which you are conducting these tallies. Just know that if you fail an initial tally attempt and there are other targets that are in range, you can try those additional targets until you are successful or until you run out of targets. But in this case, our German flight was successful off the bat, and we'll forego the other checks for the sake of this demo, and we'll move on into air combat. Okay, as you can imagine, for this type of game, combat or air combat is a pretty important aspect of the game. In fact, many of the flights will have specific tasks or missions that are dedicated to hunting down and destroying or eliminating or forcing your enemy to retreat, and a lot of that applies to the Germans, but also the British have those types of missions or tasks as well. This is Bloody April, after all. Basically, the process for attempting to or to conducting combat, there's a couple different stages. First of all, you would actually have to move into your enemy's hex and meet a certain number of conditions to be eligible for combat. Basically, to be eligible for combat, you have to have an air-to-air weapon, right? You actually have to have something to shoot that's non-depleted, meaning that you still have ammo. You have to have a task or a mission that allows you to engage. So there are certain tasks, we're not seeing them in this scenario, but there are some tasks where you are not allowed to engage the enemy because you are so engrossed in your immediate mission. And you have to have some planes that are in your flight that are not damaged or crippled. So if all of your planes are damaged or if all of your planes are crippled, you are not eligible to engage or attempt any type of combat, any type of air-to-air combat. So as I mentioned, we do know, or I do know, that the German flight A meets all of those conditions. Let's say for the purposes of this demo, it is the German player's turn. He pulled the chit. He's allowed to move one flight. He sees that he's in range of the now currently tallied British flight, and so he's going to close to engage. So he moves within the hex of the British player, and then what we would do immediately next is conduct an engagement check. I will say that before we do that if you try to engage an enemy If you fail the engagement and you have another enemy that is within range of your remaining movement points, you could then attempt to engage another enemy. But let's take a look at a couple things here as far as engagement goes. In the engagement check, each flight is going to check to see if they successfully engage the enemy. So even though it's the German player that moved into the British player's hex, we're going to check to see if both of those successfully engaged. And basically, the target number for rolling is based on the current status, the visual status, so to speak, of the enemy. So, we just went through the tally marker or the tally phase or the visual identification phase. The British player is tallied. So over here in the engagement table, the target number for the German player to roll to successfully engage is a 9. The German player is currently undetected. He has not been visually identified. He has not been identified by ground observation. So he's got this little question mark. So he is much harder to engage for the British player, and the target number for the British player is 15. So 2d10, 9 or higher for the German player to detect the British player, 15 or higher for the British player to successfully engage. This roll is modified by a series of die roll modifiers. There's a modifier that's known as the aggression value, which speaks to the quality or experience of the flight, whether the target has an altitude advantage or not. The target is lower, rear hemisphere, fog, different weather conditions, a whole host of die roll modifiers. Not all of them will apply all that often, but things like aggression value and altitude certainly will play a role. Let's go ahead and calculate these really quickly to give you an example, and so we can kind of do this with a little bit more realism or more accuracy. Let me pull up the flight chart again, or the flight log. So we'll go ahead and do the British calculation first. Flight number 2 is actually a regular aggression value. And when you're setting up the scenario, you have the option of determining a value for that aggression value at the outset, or you can roll for it the first time that you need it. So I've left it blank for now, but because of this engagement check, we do need it. So I pull up my flight quality table. Flight number 2 is has regular pilot training. I would roll 2d10 and I would check that regular column, generating a value of -3 to +2. And the aggression value is really important. It applies to a lot of different roles. Obviously, it applies to engagement. It's going to apply to other combat roles that we're going to do here in a moment. It applies to the wind-up check. And again, it applies to the general overall expertise, training level, confidence, morale, etc. of the particular flight. But for the sake of argument in this demo, let's say that we rolled a 10 and the pilot flight quality is a 0, so no die roll modifier. Our target actually came in at a higher altitude than we did. So the target does not have the German player is actually higher in altitude. So we do want to apply a -2 modifier because the German is higher. So naturally the target is lower. Die roll modifier does not apply. If the target was in our rear hemisphere, we would actually have another die roll modifier to apply. Hemispheres are actually described a little bit more in the play aids, but you can actually see from the map itself that the units were actually coming directly right at each other. So they actually came in head to head. So nobody's in the rear hemisphere. And then all of the other modifiers are related to weather, which in this particular case does not apply to this situation. But if you were in fog, if you were facing the sun, if you were in snow or rain, if you were at night, there might be other modifiers. So again, no zero aggression value, but our target does have the altitude advantage, so it's a -2 modifier. So really I need a 17 or higher. So this is going to be very difficult for the British to be successful with engaging. But let me go ahead and roll it anyway. Yeah, so I rolled a 3. The engagement check for the British player fails. Let's do the same for the German player. Much like the British player, we need to check for their aggression value. This was counter A, Jaster number 4, and you'll see that they actually have a different aggression value, and it's a veteran, or VET. So they actually roll in a different column in that flight quality table. So you can actually see that they can generate somewhat higher values for their aggression level. Let's, for the sake of argument, say that the aggression value that they roll is a 16, or flight quality that they roll is a 16, so their aggression value is +2. So the modifier is +2. The target is actually lower, so that nets +3, and that's the entire die roll modifier. But again, I have this much lower target value because the target was tallied in the prior phase. So I need a 9 or higher with a +3 modifier overall. 5 + 3 is 8, so I officially would have failed, but for the sake of this demo, there we go. There's a 12, +3 is 15. The German player successfully engages. And so you can think that through a combination of failures and successes, there will be different outcomes. So if the attacker, in this case the German, engages but the defender does not, which is actually what happens in this case, combat occurs, but the attacker has surprise and the defender is at a disadvantage. And this will impact some of the rules that we'll do in a moment. If the attacker and defender are both successful with their engagement rolls or engagement checks, combat occurs, but there is no surprise or disadvantage. If neither attacker or defender are successful with their rolls, then as you can imagine, no combat occurs. And then finally, if the attacker fails their roll and the defender is successful, then the defender has the choice of engaging combat with no surprise or disadvantage, or they can abort or ignore the combat or engagement attempt. Okay, so this is another one of those examples, I think, where it takes quite a bit longer to explain than it actually takes to do once you get it under your belt a couple times. But basically, our flights have flown into the same hex. We've done an engagement check. Our German player has surprise, and our British player, unfortunately in his case, is at a disadvantage. And so the next step in the combat sequence is to check for maneuver. And so you're basically going to check to see, based on the maneuvering capabilities of your planes, how many shots they're going to get off. Are they nimble enough? Are they quick enough? Can they turn, dive? Can they get into that hairball that is a dogfight and generate an opportunity to get off a shot or multiple shots? So as you can imagine, we have another table for that, and it's called the maneuver table. The maneuver table is a cross-reference of 2d10, a 2d10 roll, and cross-reference with a number of airplanes in your flight. So you remember the British flight had 4 planes in it, and Jasta 4 has, 5 planes in it. So the British player is going to be in a lot of trouble, it seems. But anyway, and then you have another series of die roll modifiers. Okay, and the number that is the result of your roll is going to indicate the number of shots that you have the opportunity to take. You don't have to take all of them, but you've maneuvered yourself in a position to take that number of shots. So let's do a quick calculation for the German player. We're going to want to focus on the die roll modifiers at first. The first one is the maneuver differential. Okay, so we need to pull up our air data cards, and you'll see in the air data card there's this MR rating. And so at each altitude band, each plane type will have an MR, or a maneuver rating. And so what we're looking for this die roll modifier is the difference in maneuver. This particular flight of Germans are Albatros D2s over here on the right. They are at low. Their maneuver rating is 6. Their target is the Sopwiths. At low, their maneuver rating is 4. So the maneuver differential is +2 in favor for the German player. The aggression differential is the next modifier. You remember that the German flight has a +2. The British flight has a 0 aggression value, so that's another +2 for the German. Geometry modifiers. If you're in a defender's rear beam, if you are, I believe, higher or lower, there's different geometry modifiers. But since we're at very similar altitudes and we flew head on to each other, there's no geometry modifier. The German player is at a slight altitude advantage, so it's another +1. So we're already at net +5. From our engagement roll, we knew that the German player has surprised. So that's another +3, so we're at +8. And all these other items do not apply. So +8, that's a lot of die roll modifiers. So +8 on the 5 column. I'll do a quick roll. 4 + 8 is 12, and so the result is 2. So the German player has moved into position to take 2 shots at the British player. Now it's the British player's turn to do the same, to check their maneuver rating, or their maneuvering, to see if they get any flights off. Most of these values are going to be the opposite. The maneuver differential is going to be -2 for the British player, versus, as we saw, +2 for the German player. So -2 for maneuver, -2 for aggression, no geometry value change, no altitude advantage, no surprise, but the British flight is disadvantaged. So -2, -2, -1 is -5. There are 4 planes in that flight, the British flight. So let's do another 2d10 roll. An 11 -5 is 6, and that's less than 9. So the British is unsuccessful in maneuvering into position to take a shot on the German player. Okay, just a couple more steps in our combat phase. Shot resolution. So we've calculated the number of shots that each flight is entitled to. And so we have yet another shot resolution table, or another table. This is the shot resolution table. And the German can roll on this up to 2 times. And why I say up to 2 times is if they reach a certain condition or situation where they feel they don't need to take additional shots, they can ignore any additional shots that they would have earned. And the reason you may want to do that is primarily to conserve ammo. There may be other situations why you want to do that, but primarily, anytime you shoot, obviously you use ammo, and you can run out of ammo in this game. The shot resolution table, another 2d10 roll. There are only a handful of modifiers. There's a combat value and a damage rating. So the combat value comes from the aggressor or the shooter's air data card, and the damage rating comes from the target's card. So let's take a look at those really quickly. So here's our Sopwith. they have a damage factor of 0. So there's no die roll modifier from the damage factor. And our Albatross D2s have a firepower of +6. So they're going to add 6 to each of their die rolls on the shot resolution table. So let's do the first roll, 2d10 plus 6. 10 plus 6 is 16. So one aeroplane would be crippled of the British's flight. And that's a pretty good result, but the German isn't quite done. So he's going to take advantage of that other shot that he maneuvered for. And he rolled another 10. So 2 planes would be crippled. All right. In a moment, we're going to find out which planes were hit. But before we do that, we need to check for ammo depletion. Let's go back to our air data card. You'll see that the Albatross D2s have a ammo rating of 2. For depletion, you're going to roll a 1d10 against the weapon depletion number, which in this case is 2. If the result is greater than that number, you're going to increase that depletion number by 1 times the number of shots. In this case, 2. So if I roll a 2 or higher, I'm going to add 2 to that number, and the next time I'm going to use that depletion number, which in this case would be 4. If you roll lower than the current ammo value, you add a depletion value of 2 times the number of shots. So this depletion number of 2 could actually go as high as 6 in this current situation. Once your depletion number, your ammo number, reaches or exceeds 10, you are out of ammo. If you are out of ammo entirely, the only thing you can really do is fly back to your aerodrome. You're basically done. You can still be a target, but you basically can't engage in any other combat. I guess truthfully, if you were on something like a recon mission, you could continue that recon mission. But for the Germans in this case, their only task is to be on offensive patrol. If they run out of ammo, they're basically done. Certain planes do have drums of ammo, and you'll see that listed here. 2d6, 3d7. The number before the D is basically the number of times you can reload that drum under certain conditions. But you also note that the planes with drums also start with much higher depletion numbers. So they run out of ammo in those drums pretty quickly. Within a shot or two, they're usually out of ammo and have to reload. Okay, so our German plane has, our German flight has inflicted 2 crippled results on its target, on the British target, the British flight. So we do need to roll on the damage allocation table to find out which planes within the British flight are hit. And so you're going to use the column that has the number of planes that are in that particular target flight. So in this case, the British flight has 4 planes in it. You're going to roll a d10 and you're going to cross-reference that with these results down here. And the number will tell you which flight, I keep on saying flight, which plane is actually hit. So number 1 would be the first plane in your listing. Number 2 would be the second plane. Number 3 would be the third plane. Okay. If you get a result that has a C in front of it, you actually apply that result to an existing plane that has an existing crippled result on it already. 2 cripples equals being shot down. Okay. Let's do a quick couple rolls for these particular attacks. 1d10 in the first case is another 10. So plane number 4 in the British flight would be crippled, and the second roll is a 7, which would be a C3, which normally would mean that the flight number 3 would be crippled. But since we already have flight number 4 is crippled, the result is actually that plane number 4 is shot down. So it's taken 2 crippled results. Plane number 4 is shot down. I would come back to my my flight log and would realize that the pilot crew duo of Dorr and Cubberley has been shot down. What happens to them on the way down? If you're interested, you have an optional shot down chrome table. Were they shot down in flames? Do their wings break away? Does the aeroplane crash land, etc., etc.? This is optional. It's simple chrome. It helps for the storytelling. It's fun, but again, it's optional. Okay, so believe it or not, you've actually made it through an entire round of air-to-air combat. Depending on how you're playing the game and with what optional rules, this will determine what happens next. For most players, I think you'll be interested in using the optional dogfight rules. And the dogfight rules are simply a continuation of the current combat with a couple of nuances that you won't find in the first round of air-to-air combat that we've covered here. Basically, what happens is if any unit, if either of the flights in the combat has ammo left and has an undamaged plane, then you enter into a dogfight automatically. There's really no choice about it. And then in the next game turn, you would pick up from there using the dogfight rules. Just a brief preview of the dogfight rules, and I won't go through them entirely, but the dogfight rules allow for additional combat that's very much like we've seen here. It just in most cases uses a different set of die roll modifiers. The other kind of unique feature about dogfights is that the side that has the defender in the dogfight, in this case the British side, they can attempt to bounce in to the dogfight with another unit. And so if they've got another unit that's in line, they see that their buddy is in trouble, they meet certain conditions, they can bounce into that dogfight and take a whack at the Germans. Okay, for demo's sake, let's go ahead and say that we're not playing the dogfight rules. Those are optional. We'll get to those perhaps when we get a couple more games under our belt. But after one round of combat, the post-combat phase enters, and this is the last step for combat. When you complete a combat phase, all units get what's called a maneuver marker. And I won't go into detail about what those are, but those basically restrict some of the movement that you can do on subsequent moves. You roll on the wind up table. So if you remember when we were talking about our anti-aircraft engagements or combat, if a unit was hit, you roll on the wind up table to see if they abort their mission. We do the same thing at the end of combat, air-to-air combat. We use a slightly different table, different column, but can ultimately have the same outcome, that the unit would abandon their mission. And there's a series of modifiers here that apply to that roll. Again, 2d10. Simply use a different different column when you're coming out of air-to-air combat. Also, when you come out of air-to-air combat, your units become undetected and all of the tally markers are removed, right? So you come out of the combat. Um, the German player is already undetected, or they would have been detected because of the combat, but everybody flips to the undetected state. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to roll for scatter. So again, think of the dogfight, swirling and twirling in the air, diving, climbing, mostly diving. We're going to do a scatter check. And so when flights come out of a combat, they're going to have a particular facing. You're going to roll a d10 and apply that result to either one of these two charts based on their facing. If they're facing a hex side, they're going to use the one on the right. If they're facing a hex corner, it's going to be the one on the left. Roll a d10 and move into that hex, and then adopt the facing of the direction of that hex. Let me give you an example. Let's roll for the German first. Roll a 1d10. He rolls a 9, so that is the hex off to the right of his facing. So he first moves into that hex and then adopts the facing of the direction that he moved. Same thing for the British player, 1d10. He rolls a 6, and that's forward and to the right. Moves into the hex and then adopts, and then adopts the facing of that direction. The other interesting thing about the scatter that the British player just went through is that he's moved into range of he was already in range, but he's moved into another hex that is in range of that German anti-aircraft gun. And so the German player would get a anti-aircraft attack on that unit. Okay, those are the primary elements of the game that I wanted to cover tonight. Again, we covered the prior to scenario setup, getting our flights and missions ready for our tasks. We talked about the random events phase, the weather phase, the detection phase, movement, and then combat. There's some additional things that I haven't covered here that are pretty straightforward. There's a tracking phase that determines whether units that have been detected become undetected, or units that have been tallied remain tallied. And there's also an admin phase where you credit flights with completing certain tasks. You can put dummy units onto the board, but pretty straightforward admin phase. And I think we've gone long enough that we've covered the primary things that I wanted to cover. At the end of the scenario, you're going to check for recovery. Basically, any flights that are still on the map after one side or the other has completely landed or exited the map or been destroyed. Any remaining flights that are on the map, you have to check for recovery, which basically means, do they make it back home safely? And then the victory phase. The victory phase is the very last step in the game. You're going to tally up your victory points based on your missions, based on your tasks, based on the included victory point calculations that are either in the playbook or maybe in the scenario and specific to the scenario itself. And whoever gets the most points wins. So great. Thanks for hanging in there with me. I'll have one last call for questions before signing off. Does anybody have any questions about anything that I went over tonight? Okay. Well, thanks for your attention. Look me up on Board Game Geek or on the Facebook page if you want to get a game going. I like introducing new players to the game. I'll see if I can match you up with someone who else may also be interested. Or if I've got time, I'd be glad to play with you myself. And again, thanks for your time tonight.